exploded.
All right, I'm Stephen Brown. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values. We're kind of running this event, except Simone Drake did all the invitations for who was going to be speaking tonight, and then she couldn't make it because one of her children is ill. So I'm sure you're all wonderful, but I don't actually know them very well. So what I propose that we do it this way. Why don't we just have each one of you, maybe we just go this direction, briefly, like very briefly introduce who you are, and then initial reactions from each of you, and then we'll kind of go from there. Does that sound good?
Okay, my name's Alice Dixon. I am an MFA Artist in Residence at the AAAS Department, African American African Studies. And I'm also a visiting scholar. I'll be teaching in the spring a Black Visual Culture class. I am on the panel specifically because my novel, the book that I'm working on while I'm in residence here, is set in Los Angeles, and it takes place from the 40s through the early 2000s and concerns the lives of people who are living sort of between these disturbances that we've just watched in the documentary.
Hi, I'm Naveed Farnia. I'm a PhD student in African American African Studies. My research broadly has to do with the relationship between racial oppression in the U.S. and U.S. imperialism since the 1960s, sort of the development of the U.S. national security state, or the evolution of it. In terms of the documentary, I think that hopefully we can sort of provide some context to what led to the events of 1992.
Hi everyone, I'm Joshua Bates. I'm a graduate of African American African Studies. I received my master's degree from that department. I'm also a full-time employee of the Curran Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, where I work on our Youth of Color initiative. And finally, I'm a lecturer in the Department of African American African Studies, teaching a class on Black political movements. So I feel like that class definitely, like that. There's some overlap between that class and what we just saw tonight. So the reason that I'm here is because I'm very interested in the mechanisms behind protests and the reasons that protests happen. So that's what it's called.
Well, so just in terms of my personal response, my family moved to Los Angeles in the late 40s on my father's side. They're from New Orleans, and lives actually in Watts. So I have family in Watts, I have family in Inglewood, I have family in South Central, which these are all sort of small municipalities within Los Angeles County. Look, my cousin is an EMT and a firefighter. A lot of my other cousins were, living in the area. We have a huge Catholic family, so just imagine like a lot of Catholics there for 60 years. There's a lot of us. And my mom's side of the family is Japanese American, so I actually also have cousins who came over in the 20s and were in the Los Angeles area before the black side of my family. So there's two very different migration experiences in Los Angeles. And so for me watching this, you see the Korean shopkeepers, a lot of stuff that's sort of left out of these stories are the migration stories that brought people into Los Angeles and how that dynamic has always sort of existed. You had Chinese coming into LA in the 1800s, you had Zoot Suit riots in the 40s with people who were Latinos, Mexicans, mostly Chicanos, who are actually descended from indigenous people who are from Los Angeles County, like from the actual place. Like they never lived anyplace else. They're not from anywhere. They're from Chavez Canyon or wherever. So watching a documentary like that, knowing, sort of how all these forces have frequently come together within LA. There have frequently been sort of uprisings like this because the economic inequalities there. It was very emotional for me. I mean, I have cousins who, like some of those locations, I know, I drive by them when I go visit people. So, it was real. And it was very dangerous for months before that and for months after that. I had been there the summer before visiting my grandmother who lived in Watts, like 86th, a little bit further north than that. But, this is a time of gangs. I mean, it's still now, but even then, like, 100,000 gang members, 9,000 cops policing, so it was already a very volatile situation. And then you add into it all of this stuff, and you know, it wasn't surprising to people who are from there that this would happen. So.
I can certainly go. Like I said, my name is Joshua Bates. I'm originally from Los Angeles, actually. I moved to Ohio in 2012. One of my first memories of watching television was actually seeing this uprising on television. And then my experience growing up was very often informed through, I mean, as it is with all of us, our race, but specifically ways that are very specific to the overlap of race that you saw in this movie, right? Because the LA uprising, the LA riots, were the first, one of the first multiracial uprisings that you've seen in the United States. And you also see how also that rage wasn't random in its articulation. It was very specific because not only is it that people didn't own property and own businesses in their neighborhoods, people that were owning businesses in their neighborhoods were engaging with their clientele in very specific ways. There was a quote in this that said, if he would have been paid his rights to king as an American citizen, this would not be happening, right? And I thought of that. I thought of my experience walking, you know, from my junior high school to my home, stopping in this grocery store. No, it wasn't a grocery store, it was a little corner store. And the way that I would be followed around perpetually. So it's not only that it's the king's rights, it's the rights of everyone who is black and brown in Los Angeles, the way that they've been engaged with by systems. And I think that there's like, while there's nothing illogical about this, right? There's nothing illogical about this uprising. There is a very clear logic and a clear articulation of rage and from a disadvantage historically and currently group. And when you see this, it's not only that it's historic, it's current. So when you see stuff that happens like in Ferguson, it's very similar in the way that it looks, its optics, but also in the discourse that is occurring. So there's another quote. I took a lot of quotes. That's why my hands are covered in ink. And it's actually like throwing me off. I'm a little bit less focused than I typically do. It said, you can place a man on the moon, but we can't cure the sickness of our cities. It's not the sickness of our cities, it's the sickness of our society. And it's a sickness that's existed since 1776, and since before that, and will continue to exist for, I think, for not even the foreseeable future, until the American project is engaged with from its roots. So yeah, that was a little bit more than I originally had planned to say, but like I said, I got like 3 pages of quotes up here. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, to sort of follow up on that, I think it's important, as Josh was saying, to sort of really make a note on terminology. What happened wasn't a riot. It wasn't a series of riots, and it was very calculated. It was a result of decades, centuries, years of anger, and of the sort of conditions surrounding people, okay, and people rising up because of that, okay. And the other term we heard a lot of in the documentary is looting. You know, this idea of looting and this racialized notion of looting that continues to prop up historically in this country. After Katrina happened in 2000, in the 2000s, the story was that, you know, there was one story that said that there was a picture of a black family, you know, getting food for themselves, and the caption was that they were looting. And when a white family was doing the same thing, they were foraging or something. You know, so right, yeah, exactly. So we have to contest with this racialized and racist terminology first of all, because we have to think about, you know, if we think about it as riots, then we take out the politics of it. We take out the history and the context of it. Okay. So which leads into, I want to read you all a couple of brief quotes to provide a little bit of context. Dan Lindsay, one of the directors of the film, had this to say about the LA uprising, 1992 uprising. He said, we wanted to avoid having people say, this happened because of this, that the rebellion happened because of such and such. In our estimation, the issues and the subtext under all of this is just way too complicated and nuanced to make definitive statements about it. Okay? So what I'm reading from that is that he's sort of decontextualizing and dehistoricizing what happened in 1992. Okay? Now I want to read you all a second quote. This is from an article in 1996 from the San Jose Mercury News. Okay? And the title of the article is America's crack plague has roots in Nicaragua war. And this is what the article says. Quote, for the better part of a decade, a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crips and Bloods street gangs of Los Angeles and funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the Mercury News investigation was found. This drug network opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels and the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. The cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America and provided the cash and connections needed for LA's gangs to buy automatic weapons. The article continues, thousands of young black men are serving long prison sentences for selling cocaine, a drug that was virtually unobtainable in black neighborhoods before members of the CIA's army started bringing it to South Central in the 1980s at bargain basement prices. Okay, so what we're seeing here is this uprising, you know, and the people and the residents who are living in these neighborhoods are aware of this, even before this article is dropping in 1996. So this uprising has political roots that predate even Rodney King, and we have to understand it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just from an anecdotal point of view, so I'm a filmmaker. I worked in Hollywood for a long time, about almost 20 years. I worked at a studio, I ran a director's company, I worked independently. And so, you know, just from a perspective of coming to Los Angeles as a small child in the 70s and the 80s, watching cousins of mine get caught up in the drug trade and end up imprisoned or dead. I have a cousin whose girlfriend and one-year-old child were machine gunned to death at a stop sign because she was in a red Hyundai, which if you were in LA in the 80s, it's like, that's the Honda Civic of LA in the 80s. And they thought she was the girlfriend of another drug dealer. You know, my cousin actually was a drug dealer, so it wasn't surprising that she was in this area at this time and could be mistaken for this other person. But you know, that was the level of violence that was already taking place in Los Angeles. You know, by the time you get to 91, I would say probably crack had taken over more than cocaine. You might have also had people freebasing, so there's this whole other economy of people cooking like they do with the meth. And then, you know, I moved back to Los Angeles in 95, but the world is very separate. When you see this film and you see where did the National Guard show up, when did they show up, when did the police decide to engage or not engage, the line of demarcation was Hancock Park. So if you lived above Wilshire, if you lived, I would say, west of Highland, but certainly west of what's that street, Rossmore above
Yes.
Wilshire, and South Central below Wilshire. If you lived west of West Adams, which is sort of more towards the, like we think of South Central here, maybe LA, like Beverly Hills is all in here, West Adams is here, and it starts to get into Inglewood, and then the Westchester, and then the Ocean. You know, the line of demarcation was really in West Adams, and they didn't protect anybody in that pocket. So, but you could live in Beverly Hills and it was just news for you on the television. You didn't even hear the helicopters because the helicopters are staging out of downtown. So it was very different. You know, they didn't have an experience of, you know, any of this income inequality. They don't know really anything about the drug wars going down in Los Angeles. You have people in South Central who never went to the beach, which is 15 miles away from them. And they're living this, you know, life just in this little pocket. So, you know, so it's not surprising that people don't know some of this history with Nicaragua and, you know, all the other immigrant groups that have had many different types of violent interactions with the police structure in Los Angeles, because the cops are coming from Simi Valley, which is 50 miles north of South Central. They're coming from Apple Valley, which is almost 100 miles away. And they're allowed to do that because they didn't have this concept of community policing or cops having to live in the neighborhoods they policed. And a lot of these guys are just coming in and they perceive the job itself as a job of control. Policing is control, so that's already a powder keg.
Absolutely. And I'm going to respond to that, and with something that Naveed said. Naveed said that this existed before Rodney King, that this problem did, and I absolutely 100% agree, because the reason that a lot of these uprisings happen is because of the ways that black and brown bodies are not just policed, but violence is enacted upon them. And there was another quote, oh God, I love these quotes, I got so many. I'm gonna write a paper after this. If you cannot get a conviction with the Rodney King videos, there could be no justice in America. And I mean, how many times have we seen videos since the Rodney King videos of black and brown people being brutalized at the hands of the police? And what are the responses by our criminal justice system to the people that are doing that, enacting that brutalization? And then I was thinking about that. It's like there was another quote, and I have like that's just how I think in quotes. It said that racism in America is as American as apple pie. And brutalization of black and brown bodies is as American as apple pie. And also uprisings underneath this sort of brutalization and oppression is also as American as apple pie, right? Because these type of uprisings, they're not new. 1992 wasn't even the first uprising in Los Angeles. And how many uprisings have occurred since Los Angeles? This was a great case study on the American way, and that's what I truly believe, is that the problem of America is a problem of race. Until we start engaging with that problem, this is going to be our future, our current, and our history.
I mean, you could trace it back to Nat Turner and before that. I mean, this type of structural, issue is part of our union. You know, it's inevitable. Like they had. For the novel, some of the information I have is anecdotal, just from growing up in and around Los Angeles, and then some of the specific research I've done. Right before Watts, you had in the 40s there was the Zoot Suit riots, they called it, which was when the cops went after all these cholos and literally were dragging them out of their vehicles and beating them. It's very similar to the types of violence that we see in '65 and that we see again in '92. In the 70s, and then before then, in the 1800s, there was a similar violent event with a Chinese immigrant community. So you have a lot of very white supremacist elements in Los Angeles County and specifically in LAPD that are about policing communities of color into non-existence, essentially. If they're not going to be compliant, then they can't exist. And a lot of these events end up with some form of eradication because with the 65 riots and with 92, you also had people who were not just dispossessed of places that they were renting and using for business, but also people who then were later unable to return to the neighborhoods because there were no infrastructure services. Nobody was coming in and even clearing away debris, and let alone refurbishing so that you could rebuild there. But now you have redlining where people couldn't get loans to then come in and do it. So you could be from the neighborhood. They had no community reinvestment plan. I mean, it was so minimal, and you had to be super qualified to get any of these loans to begin with. So now you have a lot of gentrification happening there because of homes that has neighborhoods that have basically sat moribund since the '92 riots. I mean, whole blocks of just half-built buildings that now developers have come in and done all kinds of stuff with. It's really, that's sort of how neighborhood changes happen in that part of Los Angeles.
Yeah, a couple things. So one of the things I think it's important to understand as well is that, historically, when we see uprisings like this, like in LA in '92, Watts in 1965, you have Newark in '67, Detroit in '67 as well. They tend to happen. They tend to jump off after cases of police violence. Okay. But the police violence in those cases is usually the last straw that leads to the rebellion. Okay? So what we have here is systematic dispossession. We have mass incarceration. We have exploitation again on a mass level. These are the conditions that then you couple that with police violence, then it springs up into revolt. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is.
Oh, I'm just thinking that's all I'm saying.
Second thing is, one of the things that the film does is that it goes from it starts with 1965, the Watts uprising in '65, and then it goes to '92. And one of the things I want to do is to then bring it up to 2017. Because right now, a lot of people are talking about, that we live in a fascist society, and that's I would say that's correct. That we're in a fascist era. But at the same time, what you see here, that's fascism. That's fascism operating. Okay, like on a sort of day-to-day basis. When we think about when we think about these things, mass incarceration, the infusion of drugs into communities, you know, and just wars that are ongoing, just permanent. We're in an era of permanent war. These are the mechanisms of fascism. This is how we arrived at where we're at today. Okay. Now, again, so one of the quotes that really struck me from the film is George H.W. Bush at the end. He says, quote, "I will use whatever force necessary to restore order." The key word there is order, right? Order. Okay? So that's, for them, for the state, the sort of, the status quo condition is this order. That's a fascist order, and we have to think about it that way historically and bring it up to the present.
So, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to ask a question. And then I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions from there. So, yeah, I've had a question ever since I watched this the first time about a month ago that I'm really dying to hear what you all say. So, my experience with the film was, I think, what the filmmakers intended it to be, this building sense of frustration and grief and anger about people doing horrible things and just getting off the hook. So that when we first start seeing people mad, right, like the guy in the bar who just sort of can't stand still, right, we're like, yes, of course, I get that. And then stuff starts to happen, and I mean, I think in the film, it's the intersection scene where truck drivers are being pulled out and beaten nearly to death. At least one of them, I think, is still alive with very severe brain damage. And it feels like at that point we have to say, whoa, okay, we can't call this an uprising. This is something close to murder. And so I feel this, I mean, I feel a very strong pull towards kind of pacifist, passive resistance modes of opposition. But part of me wants to say also, yeah, but sometimes you gotta do something more than that, right? And I wonder what you think about the space between passive resistance and beating random truck drivers nearly to death on the street. And for me, the one time when I felt like I could just completely cheer was when they flipped the police car and set it on fire. That felt to me like, yeah, okay, that fits. That's appropriate to what just happened. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I'll just, as somebody who also has very deep roots in that area of Los Angeles for, many decades, you have to remember this is an area where you may have somebody like, and I don't think any of these people are deserving of what happened to them in terms of the level of violence, but in terms of being targeted, you have communities where police do search and seizure at will.
Yep.
You have communities where you could be pulled over by a cop and die that day for no good reasons or for all the right reasons and all the terrible reasons. This is a place where random violence is the order of the day and has been for decades. LA has never been a place in South Central, in the communities where black people live, where order means anything. It's always meant whatever is in the head of the cop who stops you. And, my father grew up there, and he was born in 47, and he told me a story about the fire station that was just down the street from his house. The cops chased a guy past the fire station, shot him, killed him, and then what did they do? They took his pants off of him so they could look at his genitals. And the guy sat in the street for almost a day. And this is Los Angeles in the summertime, so just imagine that. And this is a neighborhood person. People knew who this person was. So sure, maybe he was committing a crime or whatever, but this is something that my father saw at 8 or 10, something like that. This is how black bodies are treated. So this isn't an area where you have, people who know a sense of order because a sense of order exists, right? This is a place where the order is whoever has the most power in any given situation. And so when you have that happening, and then you have, a moment, my understanding of that particular intersection where all that stuff was happening is those were gang members, and those were people who had decided they were going to do a protest. And perhaps it started out in a good place. I'd like to believe that it did. But it went south from there. There were a lot of people there who were not from that neighborhood, who were traveling through there for whatever reasons. The Latino guy who got the hell beat out of him, he lives in San Pedro now. His name was Jose something or other. I don't even know if he really spoke English. He was living in a completely different economic world than the rest of Los Angeles. A lot of Latinos live in an all-cash economy, so it's a very different opportunities to make money, and Black people don't have those opportunities. So, so I think that when we think about what happened, why are these people being attacked, they're representing things. They're sort of, moving metonyms for order and control and who has what power. And I think if you think of it in terms of who has what power and what does an uprising represent? An uprising represents trying to disrupt the power structure. And so anyone who's outside of, that structure is now going to be an object to be acted upon. So, there's a reason the cops didn't go in. They knew what was going on.
And I'd like to piggyback off your statement, actually, and talk about this order, right? Because the structures that these people exist in, those are racialized. Like, the racial order is part of that order.
I'm Black, I'm Black in real life, but also, like, every place else, I'm Latina, I might be Polynesian. In LA, when I get pulled over by a cop, I always am Black on the ticket. They don't even ask me.
Absolutely, and because you're Black in Los Angeles, and you're Black in the United States, you're acted upon in a certain way, right? So it's not only that, because they didn't say go after Asian and white cops. They said Asian, they used epithets, but they said Asians and whites, and that's not just because of policing. That's because of the microaggressions that exist on a daily basis by people who have power in that neighborhood. That's like a loan officer's not not providing loans to your families. That's all the different types of structures which people exist in and have been acted upon negatively because of their race. And once again, I'm pulling a quote. Naveed talked about this like basically being the last straw, right? And the last straw is this police violence, but it's all of this violence, all of this aggression, all of this hate that is based on the race of the people that are existing in these spaces that creates this bubble which oftentimes historically and currently bursts. And we see that this lack of justice, the video didn't actually do anything, right? And we've seen that since, that the video didn't do anything. And this is what people have been saying in the United States for years about how they've been engaged with by the police. And not just by the police, by social workers, by teachers, by people with power, doctors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'm not saying that man should have been hurt the way that he was or brutalized the way he was. That is absolutely terrible. He represented a lot more than just himself in that instance. The way that Black people do every single day.
I'll just add that, Amilcar Cabral, a revolutionary, Cape Verdean revolutionary rebel against colonialism, has a saying, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'll do my best. It says that there's two kinds of armed struggle. There's the armed struggle in which the oppressor brutalizes us and we do nothing about it, and then there's the armed struggle in which we don't act crazy and we actually fight back. So, I think what we're witnessing here in this documentary is people fighting back, but don't have a sort of movement mechanism to fight back in a way that is organized armed struggle. Okay, it's organized in the sense that you have people who are upset and angry over years and decades of violence and brutality and exploitation or whatever, and what have you. But at the same time, you have these oppressive forces draining the sort of mechanisms for movement building ever since the 1960s. So mass incarceration, for example, is a direct response to the rebellions of the 1960s, into the movements of the 1960s. First SWAT team ever used against the Black Panther Party, right? Black Panther Party is fighting for revolution of all, for the liberation of all oppressed peoples everywhere. Okay, and they're not saying, they're not just saying Black power for Black people. They're saying white power for white people, yellow power for yellow people, red power for red power for red people. They're organizing and sort of building solidarity with other movements and other peoples across the U.S. and across the globe. okay? That's one of the reasons why they're probably one of the most repressed organizations in this country's history, right? So we have to understand then that that what's happening here is the disempowerment and the dispossession of people then results in people fighting back in a way to sort of empower themselves to take control of the streets, okay? And it doesn't look pretty, obviously it doesn't look pretty, and we could argue that it's not very effective in the long run. But they're doing what they can, you know? And we don't have to talk about the moral merits of it, but this is what happens whenever you live in a violent society, in a fundamentally white supremacist and racist society.
But you know, people also don't, you know, we talk about what types of things are organized and how can people have resisted. And Los Angeles has always been a place where there has been a tremendous amount of community engagement, people running community centers, people doing, you know, a lot of different types of nonviolent organizing activities. You know, they did have their sort of Black Panther Party stuff. You know, my father was involved with some of that stuff. And you know, aside from just the Black Panther Party being repressed, those activities are not supported by any formal form of government. So you don't have a situation where you have people who are, you know, now there are a few of them, but really it's so few. I mean, you know, you have people who are former gang members who are trying to help youth. Well, that has always been happening. These gangs started because there were no youth centers. These gangs started because they didn't have jobs. My dad was in a gang that was just a bunch of dudes. They called themselves the Young Bloods. And there was another group of guys in the next 10 blocks over that were the Dukes. And they were just knuckleheads running around trying to none of them had fathers and they were bored. And, you know, their mothers couldn't keep them under control. And then so into that you have the introduction, you know, this sort of then gets slowly built up as violence is introduced through, you know, drug dealing. Drugs are brought into the neighborhoods. People are now starting to make money out of these gangs, which before they had really just been a way for them to have fellowship with one another. And then, you know, and it sort of keeps building from there. So you don't have the government investing in any kind of community center. Now you may have Homeboy Industries, which is run by a priest, but he doesn't get money from the county. He's not officially a part of any state-sponsored anything, any federal monies. I'm sure he gets grant money, but that's under his power. That's because he writes grants to get money. We're not investing in these communities. So it's not surprising then that the way to upend the order, the way to retake power, is going to not look the way that society thinks is acceptable. You know, society has done nothing to invest in these communities.
And just to add to that really quickly, not only have they not done nothing, but they've invested plenty of resources to destabilize and destroy these communities, right?
Questions?
I want to build off a couple things you both brought together. This word representation keeps popping up, and for me, my name is Dakota Saul. I'm a fifth year in urban gender and sexuality studies, doing my thesis research in representation specifically. My own research is in the queer and trans community, looking at like post-Stonewall riots into now. So when we start talking about like political resistance and how like riots in that history and like, populations and humanity specifically fits into that is really interesting to me. And so Joshua, you were talking about like this apple pie, racism and this brutality is inherent to our fabric of America. And I was involved in 2015 when John Crawford was shot in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and we marched from the Beaver Creek where he was shot all the way down to the courthouse where those officers weren't indicted. So when I look at these representations, it's this cyclical cycle of media representation on these bodies, these violences, and realize we've almost gone backwards. Would you agree with me in saying, have we gone forward, gone backwards, or not changed at all?
Do you want me back?
Yeah,
well, I mean, I feel like my gut feeling is that it's not that we've gone forward or backwards. I think that it's just re-articulated different generationally, right? The oppression is are re-articulated. And I mean, at one point it was redlining, slavery, Jim Crow oppression, the prison industrial complex. the segregation that exists currently in inner cities, gentrification, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's that these systems are, the system of white supremacy and racism in the United States is articulated onto the city structure and onto the society structure, and because of that, it's never going to be, we're engaging with the symptoms of a bigger problem, right? So if we're trying to engage with gentrification, we're not engaging with the mechanisms that have allowed for gentrification. And when I think about police violence especially, that is an articulation of a much larger problem. Like you were talking about, these police officers are coming from Apple Valley and the John Crawford case. And then there's also...
And those are white supremacist areas. When we say Apple Valley and Simi Valley, these are people who are openly members of the KKK.
And then, you know, I mean, in Columbus, Ohio, you go to rural Ohio, and those are the people that are policing our inner cities in Columbus, Ohio. And then when we talk about the gun violence that exists in Columbus, Ohio, why is that? And I think that has to do with the lack of community of policing. I think it has to do with lack of accountability. And why is there a lack of accountability? Whose bodies allow them to be violated, and whose don't? Because there was one other thing, okay, back to my quotes. I was gonna do it. There was one other one that was said, what did it say? It said something like, the next person will be a white person. And I thought about that when that woman was killed. I think it was in Milwaukee, or it was somewhere in the upper Midwest. And she was killed by a police officer. And the types of, like first off, the guy who the chief of police was fired. You know, there was a massive investigation. There's a massive, like, multi-ethnic rallying around this. Like, they couldn't believe it. And I was thinking, I mean, that how many times does that happen to a black person? And the response is, what was he doing wrong, right? Onus is on the person that's dead. And I think that says something about, like, how this oppression is
I mean, but also, like, even just in using the term gentrifying, you know, you gentrify something if you're a member of the gentry, right? And so who is the gentry? The gentry are the landowners. They are people who are from the upper class. So if you're going into a neighborhood, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates, sort of in my mind, infamously said he considers himself a gentrifier. But the reality is that as a black person, he is not a member of the gentry, no matter how much money he acquires. A cop who doesn't recognize him is not going to treat him as a member of the gentry. And we very much have that class system in operating form in every community in the U.S., where you do have people who are automatically impugned with upper class, i.e. good values, which is, you know, cops are automatically assumed to be under threat from a perpetrator in fear of their lives. Right, but a cop's job is to always be in, like, that's what their job is. So we don't accept that from a soldier. You know, if a Marine came into a review, a debrief, and said, well, I feared for my life, so I just killed everybody in the room, they would get in trouble. That would be a group court-martial. Like, they'd be kicked out of the Marine Corps. But we don't have any expectation that our cops have that same level of consideration or rules of engagement or any of that, because for whatever reasons, they are now given these qualities of, you know, sort of delicacy in some ways, some fragility. You know, their fear is an operating function of their job. So if they are afraid, that now becomes a function of order. The level of fear they have is the level of freedom that you get, you know? So, you know, even just with that word gentry, I think we can gentrify. I think we can then think about how the system is working and is conscious of itself working.
Yeah, just to add as well, I agree with Josh that, you know, better or worse. I don't know how much we should think about it.
I didn't say better or worse. I think forward and backwards is
forward and
connotated differently.
Yeah, I think Josh is correct. Like, I think that historically we see oppression and re-articulate itself in different ways, and I think it's a result of moves and counter moves between oppression and resistance. So when you talk about Jim Crow, for example, Jim Crow doesn't end without some substantive mass resistance against it. Then again, you know, the state then sort of re-articulates itself and reinstitutes oppression in the form of mass incarceration.
And redlining.
You're right. So there's that. I think that I will say though that there's actually been a shift in terms of public sentiment, and I guess we could say, you know, white public sentiment since 1992. So I did a little bit of research, and I found that. According to one article, I don't remember where I found it, but 89% of the public disagreed with the King verdict. And then after 2012, only 31% of people thought that George Zimmerman should have been convicted for Trayvon Martin. So shifting sentiment changing, I guess, climate, changing times, whatever. But yeah, I still agree with Josh's.
I always have more
I have
questions
a
for
question.
Bill.
Until 1 year ago, Obama was the president, so a black man president of the United States for 8 years. I think all the world, everybody was amazed by that. And what is the meaning of that? There is something that changed in the United States, or what is the meaning of having a black man as a president?
I mean, I think some people who are maybe more radical than others would question how operately black was Obama. So was he just black enough? Because certainly there are far more radical positions he could have taken in terms of the police state, in terms of making sure that there were protections in place for after he left office. And there were a ton of positions he chose not to explore. With the Skip Gates thing, I think, clearly Skip Gates is a professor at Harvard. He's at his own home, and he's arrested, by a cop who doesn't believe he belongs there. But why does this cop then earn a presidential visit to make peace? What are they really trying to do there? And is that really the function that, if someone were more radically black, more radically anti-white supremacy, is that what would have happened? And certainly, a president who is in charge of the Department of Justice and can order any kind of consent decree type of investigation he wants. So I don't know. I mean, I think maybe it helps certain people feel better about progress in the U.S. And this notion of being quote unquote post-racial, which in my mind, race equals white supremacy. So I don't know how we can be post-white supremacy when black people are still being murdered for being black. A friend of mine got pulled over in Missouri this last week. For no good reasons. There's nothing wrong with her car, and luckily the guy's partner was a black cop, and she was able to go. So is white supremacy dead? I don't think so. So we're not post-racial.
I guess I can go back to like the idea of representation and what it means when you think about having a black president, right? Like, what does that mean to different types of people? And I think that part of that is like, hey, we now can live in like this post-racial utopia. So that means that the policies can be enacted that don't have a racial lens, and we can move to other issues, because Obama represents like this fabrication of this American dream, in my opinion. I'm not even talking about like his actions, I'm just talking about what he represents. And then also there was a movie I watched called The Interrupters. There was a quote in it, surprising enough, that said something along the lines of, how can we have a black president of the United States when we have all these inner city kids dying each and every day that are black? And I think that also, that says something, that irrespective of Obama's own political moves, he still is the president of a white supremacist, hegemony. That, and in some ways, even having him elected sort of allowed for this resurgence of white nationalism that promoted Donald Trump to office. So when you think about moves and counter moves, this racist project is still going to be this racist project, and hegemony is going to shift, but it'll always find a way to re-articulate itself. So even having a black president allowed for a lot of very negative things to happen to people of color in the United States.
Go ahead.
What I was going to say is that this basically it's mainstream media when it comes to classifying someone as the race. Like, take for example, right now, the royal wedding is going to take place sometime in May of 2018, but they describe the sister as being biracial. They don't say that she's black, and you all, they're kind of young, but you may not remember that when Obama was first running, he was never really described as being black. He was always described as being biracial. And whenever they did show his family, they talked about his mother and his grandparents being raised in Hawaii. There was always this white family around, but nothing about his except from Donald Trump, about his Kenya past, and his father, who was not around, supposedly. So when it comes to the so-called post-racial time that we live in, it's just non-existent. It's just that they changed the terminology, the language.
I mean, this is very much like, the post-civil rights era, where you have people pushing back against things like affirmative action, and people pushing back against, certain types of diversity and inclusion things, calling quota systems politically correct, like terms like that start to rise, right? Because people feel like we have enough equality now.
I will say about Obama as well that, interestingly, state militarization, police militarization, accelerated under Obama far beyond any previous measure. The Obama administration funded local and state police forces more than any other president. And then he reversed militarization in 2015 after nationwide protests against police violence and state violence.
Yeah, he was letting them buy MRAPs, which is bananas. I mean, cops don't need MRAPs.
So,
speaking about problematic bureaucracies, we have to know your names to get the pizza paid for. Write that down while we chat, that'd be great.
So this question of representation is interesting too, because to think about it on a global level and think about it in the context of imperialism and colonialism, we see that after colonialism, you have people, black and brown faces coming to power in their respective countries, right? But the situations in these countries don't change after colonialism ends largely, right? So we might think about Obama as sort of the neo-colonial face of this sort of colonial project or the imperial project within the U.S. Black people in the U.S. are colonized people, just like people elsewhere were colonized as well. Native Americans here are colonized people. We live in a settler society, settler colonial society, and we have to think about it in a colonial context.
I have a question. Is there any good news? So, I mean, with regard to things like the structure of police forces and how they relate to these racially segregated communities, and are there any places that are doing better than others that you can think of that you might be willing to say that's kind of the right direction, even if it's not there yet?
I mean, I think if you're thinking in terms of policing, no, the notion of policing is automatically the suppression of black and brown bodies. So, I do think there's places like in Oakland, where I live in the Bay Area, you have this idea of restorative justice, which is, in my mind, I personally have a lot of ideological issues with it, but the notion is that injured parties meet with one another and a community mediator to come up with a plan for sort of a restored sense of well-being and safety within the community. I think that works if you have a very strong cultural system, but America, the project of America has been about the destruction and cultural genocide of non-white peoples, non-European peoples. And so in that context, until it becomes okay for black women to wear natural hair in the workplace and be considered neat, kempt, and professional, until you have, Leslie Jones is marrying Prince Harry. Until that happens, I don't know that there can be really just policing, because we are not imputed with qualities of goodness and fairness and, and thought of as being equal. And so within that system, you have cops are high school graduates. In fact, when you take the test to become a cop, if you're too smart, you can't make it. So that should tell you that's the standard of policing in the U.S. I mean, that's bananas.
And I guess better is I don't know if I can necessarily say better, but there are checks being put into place in specific areas, like Columbus, Ohio. The mayor came out with a reversal of funding the Summer Safety Initiative, which had which was a very racialized policing mechanism in inner city Columbus, which had jump out boys, which are basically vans that have police officers in them that go around and jump out and harass young black and brown men in Columbus. And that exists all over the country, but specifically in Columbus, Ohio, because of all the organizing that's gone on from the grassroots level, organizing communities and protesting and pushing back on in all these different ways. The mayor just came out and said he's going to reverse that and find a different, and not just defund the Summer Safety Initiative, but I think that there's going to be some sort of review board. But who's going to be on that review board? We got to ask ourselves that. And also, how many black people died in Columbus, Ohio for that to get passed? I mean, right, like Tyree King was a 13-year-old boy running away from the police on the east side of Columbus and got shot in the back. And if we think about it like that, then this is just another reaction to what policing represents in inner cities, and policing will always represent in not just inner cities, in all across in the United States, right? Safety for some, but terror for others.
Yeah, I in terms of the question of hope, I think I do actually. I think there's hope. When you see people mobilizing on the streets, for me, the sort of perverse thing about the last year's election was that a lot of people mobilized in terms of specific causes. But these causes over time, they become generalized into thinking about more general issues: police brutality, travel bans, walls, whatever you want to talk about. I think what happened with the Trump election is that we saw that the contradictions in the society are being further and further exposed, and as they become exposed, people will mobilize more and more. And I think that's where hope lies. People in the streets.
Yeah. And that was a quote from the movie, right? Is that I think it said that let me see what page that was on. It said communities lead, they don't follow, right?
I can do what you want.
Communities follow. I don't know. I was watching that. And I was like, these are sound bites. These are sound bites after sound
I
bites.
can't write that fast.
Yeah, I can. But look what happened. Yes. Right. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So going off what you said about Trump, I've always wondered if, after his presidency, becoming a person, he doesn't have a full presidency, but we'll see about that. After his presidency, if people will continue to be, like you said, mobilizing the same way, or if kind of like after the civil rights movement, like people just kind of like, they got tired and they got sick of it, they kind of didn't pay as much attention to it, and they went back into their old ways. And I think you kind of answered it, but if anybody else wants to comment on it, like, do you think that we will continue to mobilize and progress in a positive way, or do you think we will go back into our old habits?
I absolutely think that we're going to keep mobilizing because people are going to continue to fight back against these oppressive systems. I also think prior to Trump's election, the largest movement of people I think happened in 2008, right, with the immigration movement that you really saw like huge in Los Angeles. So you see people always are moving and pushing back against these oppressive forces. So that's kind of where I get hope too from on like a community level. The people that fight daily. I mean, not just the people that fight back overtly in public ways, but the mom who continues to invest love into her kids and support her kids, even though she has to work 2 jobs, right? And that gives me hope too, because there's people that are finding a way, irrespective of all the terrible things that have been done to them currently, or are happening to them currently, and have happened to their communities historically.
Frankly, I think that people will have to stay mobilized because honestly, in terms of like the political establishment, I'm not convinced that the person after Trump is going to be, it might be worse. I think that again, like the sort of political climate that we're living in today, the sort of overt naked fascists are gaining more and more power every day, and they're attacking like every institution in society. Like, we're talking about the media, like all this stuff about fake news and all that stuff. The media is not like, the media is a liberal institution that participates in the oppression of black and brown people. But at the same time, that these liberal institutions are being attacked means that the fascists are gaining, these overt fascists are gaining more and more power on a day-to-day basis. They're, even like sports, they're going after, protesters in sports. Like that's how, and this is how fascism gains a foothold in society,
Well, that woman who flipped off Trump, and the other woman who laughed at Jeff Sessions. I mean, I don't think that you can count on any type of movement to be sustained in a trend situation, right? Like, you're not going to have any movement for freedom where people feel like, oh, well, everyone joins it eventually. No, we join movements because we are no longer able to stay at peace with what we have. And that's either economic peace, it's psychological peace, it's a sense of social justice. And so if you have more people whose sense of social justice is not disturbed by police brutality, you have no movement to change it. I think right now, we're in a moment where a lot of people who have been sexual predators are being called to account, but frankly, they're mostly men who are preying upon white women. We don't have people who have famously preyed upon black women or Native women being called to account. And will we have that moment? I don't think so. Certainly those of us in communities that are affected by people like this have always been doing the work. It's whether or not the people who are not affected will then join in. And I don't think that's a trend thing. I don't think that you can say everybody's doing it right now and then in the future there'll be more. Until those people, they said the SNCC thing was no justice, no peace. And so until someone's peace has been disturbed, for most people, I would say 70% of the human population, they'll just sit there inertly and just accept that, they're fine.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about R. Kelly, that's something I always think
That's
about.
what I'm saying.
I mean, I think about
This
it.
dude has been running through black girls.
Yeah, doing all this terrible stuff to black women for the longest, and there was not this public
25, 30
outcry,
years,
right?
yeah.
So I completely agree with you. But back to the topic that we're talking about right now. When it comes, I think that while certainly we're seeing like a resurgence of fascism, and we see like these fascists, this is the way that fascism finds a foothold in society. We're also seeing that with Trump's election, that people are like waking up, and that's why I got hope too when I saw all these people moving. Because even if it's only 1 in 10 of those people that continue to fight throughout their lives, that's way more than we're fighting prior to Trump. So, like you said, there's measures and there's countermeasures, and this lifelong fight against oppression, and I don't think it's ever going to stop.
Can I say one last thing before we close up, Steve?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Shameless plug for something called OSA. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but that 2015 walkout round for John Crawford was actually organized by OSA, the Ohio Student Association, which is people who are directly affected by these legislative issues, getting in small rooms, generally held in the Summit Church on 16th. One of the most powerful organizations I've ever had the chance to be with, and talking about these flashpoint movements. In that moment, one of the people who organized it said, we thought the revolution was coming and that it fizzled out, and how do you cope with that? How do you keep moving on? And the beauty is that OSA now exists out of somebody's loss of life, and there's people in Ohio pushing, talking with the mayor, talking in Columbus to change things. And it's not just they, but it's we. It's every person in this room has the chance to go out and do something with the knowledge that they've got in this room.
I mean, and you do have people who are taking they call them in the corporate world, best practices for mobilizing social activity and social protest, and putting it on digital platforms like that Resist Bot, where you can text Resist Bot and then she'll send out letters to your local representatives, and if you send out enough, eventually you can then send out messages to so any issue that bothers you, text Resist Bot, and then they'll come back with you and sort of draft these letters and fax them out or physically mail them. So, I do think that there is a possibility for best practices to become something that then dedicated that 30% of people who are going to be doing this type of work to make it easier for maybe the next 30% to engage, people who are bothered but are either too ignorant, lazy, or busy to do something about it. And then, the rest of those fools, I don't know what we can do with them. The other 40%. I think those are the people who need to be moved. So.
We should probably formally wrap up since we said 8:30 and it's no longer 8:30. But we won't stop you from hanging out and chatting as long as people want to do that. So let's thank our panelists.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
That's good.
Who said that? Was it?